There is a particular silence that follows the first time you say no. It is not anger, and it is not distance yet. It is the sound of someone recalculating. You can hear it in the pause before they answer. Something is being revised on the other side of the conversation, and it is not their opinion of what you refused. It is their understanding of what you are for. You said very little. You did not accuse them, withdraw your care, or end the relationship. You simply failed to become convenient at the expected moment. Yet the temperature of the room changes so quickly that you can almost feel a hidden agreement being exposed. An agreement you never signed and never knew was being kept on your behalf. What unsettles you is not their disappointment. It is how quickly some part of you volunteered to remove it. Then comes the space. Between their request and your answer, there were perhaps 2 seconds. And you have crossed that space 10,000 times without ever standing in it. This time, for reasons you cannot explain, you stayed. That is the entire event. It was enough to make visible something that years of generosity had kept carefully out of view. For years, you may have called this kindness. You anticipated what people needed, softened your refusals, and translated your preferences into something less demanding. You knew how to prevent tension before anyone admitted it existed. Because others felt comfortable around you, you assumed you were creating love. Only later did you begin to wonder why that love became uncertain whenever you stopped managing their comfort. The first refusal rarely feels like freedom. It feels like evidence against your own goodness. Your chest tightens while the other person becomes quiet, and the old explanation arrives immediately. You are being difficult. You have changed. You should have said yes because it would have cost less than this distance. Pleasing them begins to look merciful again, even when the person receiving the mercy is never you. This is why stopping does more than alter behavior. It changes what you are able to see. While you were accommodating everyone, affection and relief often arrived together. People felt warmly toward you at the same moment that you removed an inconvenience from their lives. The two experiences became so closely joined that neither you nor they had to ask where appreciation ended and dependence on your compliance began. Some of them did love you. That is part of what makes the recognition difficult. Human affection is rarely pure enough to fit a clean verdict. A person can care for you and still prefer the version of you who asks for little. They can value your presence while quietly resisting your separateness. Their love may be real, yet organized around permissions you never knew you were granting. The painful discovery is not simply that people used you. That explanation is too easy, and it leaves your own inner bargain untouched. The deeper discovery is that being pleasing allowed you to remain close without testing whether closeness could include disagreement. Compliance protected you from a question you were not ready to ask. Would they still move toward you if you stopped moving away from yourself? As long as you kept saying yes, the answer remained hidden. Every favor delayed it. Every swallowed preference protected the relationship from having to reveal its structure. You could interpret their warmth as acceptance because your difference had not fully entered the connection. They were responding to you, but they were also responding to how little friction your presence created in their lives. What you called peace may have been a relationship in which only one person absorbed the conflict. The disagreement did not vanish. It moved into your jaw, your sleeplessness, your private irritation, and the fatigue that arrived before certain conversations. Everyone else experienced harmony because you were carrying the part of reality that would have disturbed it. Your pleasantness was doing invisible labor. You may have watched yourself do this without recognizing it as work. During a conversation, you begin to say what you actually need. Then remove the final words and replace them with something softer. The other person relaxes. You feel a small relief that you never examine, because examining it would require asking what you traded for it. Then something begins to fail. Perhaps you are too tired to provide the careful explanation. Perhaps resentment has made your usual warmth impossible to perform. Perhaps a simple preference reaches your lips before you can edit it. You do not become cruel. You merely stop protecting everyone from the fact that you are a separate person. And the relationship suddenly has to meet someone it was never required to accommodate. This is the moment many people misread. They think the discomfort proves that the boundary was wrong, yet the discomfort may be revealing the cost that your old agreement kept hidden. A relationship accustomed to your flexibility will experience your limits as a loss. Even when those limits are ordinary, their reaction does not automatically condemn them, but it does reveal what they had come to expect from you. Expectation can disguise itself as intimacy when it has been satisfied for long enough. The person may say that you are no longer open, generous, or understanding. What they often mean is that access, which once required no negotiation, now has conditions. They are not only meeting your refusal, they are meeting the end of an arrangement that allowed your empathy to function as permission. Your empathy made that arrangement easier to preserve. You could sense their disappointment before they expressed it. You could imagine the pressure behind their request, the loneliness behind their demand, and the fear behind their coldness. Understanding gave you a reason to override what you felt, because their behavior made psychological sense. You treated it as something you were responsible for accommodating, but understanding why someone reacts as they do is not the same as owing them the response they want. This distinction often arrives late for the person who has built closeness through comprehension. You may know exactly why your refusal hurts them and still be unable to offer what they ask. Their history can explain their disappointment without turning your compliance into the cure. Jung gave a name to the face a person constructs for the outer world. He called it the persona, and in Times, 2 essays on analytical psychology Times, he described it as a compromise, an arrangement between the individual and society concerning what a person should appear to be. He was careful to say that this compromise is not a lie. A society requires recognizable faces, and a psyche requires some protection from constant exposure. The persona is an achievement before it becomes a problem. The trouble begins when the role becomes so convincing that even the person performing it forgets what has been excluded. In your case, the acceptable face may have been endlessly receptive. Beneath it lived irritation, preference, limits, and the forbidden wish to be loved without first making yourself easy to love. Those excluded reactions do not disappear because goodness disapproves of them. They wait, they enter through exhaustion, delayed replies, sudden bluntness, or the strange relief that comes when a request is cancelled. You may judge these moments as failures of character, yet they can also be the return of information that your pleasing identity was not permitted to carry. Anger may be among the first signals, but it is not always anger at the other person alone. Some of it is directed toward the years in which you offered agreement before checking whether agreement was true. Some belongs to the realization that you helped teach people which version of you would always arrive. Their expectation did not form in isolation. Your fear of disappointing them participated in its creation. That recognition is not blame. You were not consciously designing your own erasure. You were preserving attachment in the most reliable way you knew. Each time tension appeared, compliance brought warmth back. Each time you expressed less, belonging felt more secure. The role continued because it worked, and because the reward was not praise alone, the reward was continued connection. This is the hidden payment inside pleasing everyone. You gave up the uncertainty of being known in exchange for the reassurance of being approved. Approval could be produced. You knew the gestures, the tone, the quick agreement, and the careful disappearance of your own claim. Being known could not be controlled, because the real person might disappoint someone and remain worthy of closeness anyway. Once you stop performing the old exchange, you lose that control. You cannot make another person respond generously to your limit. You cannot guarantee that affection will remain warm when usefulness is withdrawn. The uncertainty feels almost unbearable because it removes the instrument you once used to secure connection. Pleasing was painful, but it allowed you to influence whether people stayed comfortable enough to stay close. Now their disappointment reaches you without the familiar remedy. Your fingers hover above a message as you consider adding another explanation. You can feel how a few softening words might reopen the warmth. The temptation is not weakness, it is memory. Your whole relational history may have taught you that distance ends when you become easier again. Yet, every unnecessary explanation can obscure what the moment is trying to show. If your simple no must be wrapped in enough reassurance to become emotionally harmless, then the other person is not encountering your limit. They are encountering a carefully altered version of it. The relationship remains peaceful, but only because you have once again protected it from the full existence of another will. This does not mean every disappointed person loved only your compliance. Mature affection can still flinch. People need time to adjust when a familiar pattern changes. And even loving people may respond badly before they understand what has shifted. The question is not whether they ever feel frustrated. The question is whether your separateness can eventually exist without being punished, mocked, or treated as betrayal. What happens after the first reaction reveals more? Do they become curious about what you need, or do they focus entirely on restoring access? Can they remain connected while the answer stays no? The pattern becomes visible not in a single imperfect moment, but in what the relationship repeatedly demands for warmth to return. Seeing this can produce grief before it produces clarity. You are not merely losing an illusion about them, you are losing the hope that enough kindness would eventually make it safe to stop being kind on command. Part of you believed your devotion was building a secure place where you could someday rest. It is painful to learn that your effort may have trained the relationship to expect more effort. There is also grief for the affection you did receive. Conditional warmth still warmed you. A role can be restrictive and still contain real memories. Laughter, tenderness, and loyalty. Recognizing its terms does not erase everything that happened inside it. This is why you may miss the old closeness, even while knowing that returning to it would require another disappearance of yourself. The separation begins inside that contradiction. You can care about someone and see that they resisted your freedom. You can understand their disappointment without making it your command. You can admit that your compliance helped preserve the arrangement without concluding that you deserved its cost. More than one truth can remain present without forcing you back into the old answer. What has changed is not that you suddenly know who everyone is. What has changed is that pleasing no longer prevents the question from being asked. Each relationship must now reveal whether it can include a person who has preferences, limits, and an interior life that does not organize itself around keeping others comfortable. The answer may arrive slowly, and it may not be the answer you wanted. For now, the hardest task is not deciding whom to keep or whom to leave. It is remaining present long enough to witness what happens when compliance is no longer the price you immediately pay for warmth. The silence after your refusal may still frighten you, but it can no longer be mistaken for proof that you were wrong to exist separately. To exist separately may feel less like a right than a risk. The fear does not arise only because someone is unhappy with you now. It comes from an older expectation that affection becomes unstable when you stop being emotionally convenient. Their silence touches a place already prepared to interpret distance as the beginning of exclusion. Long before you understood compliance as a pattern, you may have noticed which version of you received the easiest welcome. The patient one was praised, the undemanding one caused relief. The person who understood every circumstance was called mature. Approval gathered around the qualities that made your presence require less adjustment from everyone else. No one had to tell you directly that your needs were unacceptable. The lesson could be delivered more quietly. A tired expression when you asked for something, a change in tone when you disagreed, warmth returning as soon as you withdrew the request. You learned through repetition that connection became smoother when your inner life stayed out of its way. Perhaps the people around you were overwhelmed, limited, or preoccupied with struggles they could barely name. Their inability to receive your full experience may not have been deliberate, yet the effect remained. You became skilled at noticing what the relationship could tolerate, then shaped your expression so carefully that your needs rarely exceeded its emotional capacity. Empathy developed beside this adaptation. You could see why another person had no room for you. You noticed their fatigue, their worry, and the pressure they carried. Because the explanation was visible, the deprivation became harder to protest. Their limitation made sense, so your disappearance began to feel compassionate rather than costly. This is where empathy can become divided against the person who possesses it. The ability to understand another mind is genuine. The difficulty begins when that understanding is used to overrule every signal coming from your own experience. Compassion becomes a court in which everyone else receives context, while your hurt appears without a defense. You may have believed that needing less made you loving. In reality, it also made relationships more predictable. If you did not ask, you could not be refused. If you adjusted first, conflict could not expose how little flexibility the other person possessed. Compliance protected attachment but it also protected you from discovering the attachment's limits. The arrangement offered a particular kind of safety. You could not control whether someone was capable of mutual care, but you could control how difficult you were to care for. You could become useful, agreeable, and emotionally inexpensive. Then, when warmth arrived, you did not have to face the terrifying possibility that it might disappear in response to the unedited person. This is why pleasing everyone became more than a habit. It became a method of preventing relational truth. It kept you from knowing who could tolerate frustration without withdrawing affection. It kept others from having to learn how to meet you. Most painfully, it kept your own preferences from developing enough strength to challenge the arrangement. A preference grows through being noticed, expressed, and allowed to matter. Yours may have been interrupted at the first stage. Before you could ask what you wanted, your attention moved toward what would keep the atmosphere calm. Desire was translated into consequence. What do I want became, what will happen to everyone else if I choose it? The answer often arrived through your shoulders lifting, your throat narrowing, or a sudden heaviness before speaking. Something had already decided before you could deliberate. This is the 2 seconds again, but you were never inside them. They belong to something older than your judgment. In his early word association experiments, Jung watched people hesitate, stumble, or fall silent around emotionally charged themes. He called the structures behind these reactions feeling toned complexes, clusters of memory and emotion that can interrupt conscious intention. A complex does not wait for a considered decision. It can alter speech, posture, and reaction before the conscious mind understands what has been touched. You may have judged yourself for reactions that seem disproportionate, but you were not merely selecting between 2 options. You were calculating how much emotional disturbance your choice might create, and the calculation was being run by a structure formed before you had language for choice. A simple preference carried the imagined weight of someone else's hurt, anger, or withdrawal. After enough repetition, other people's comfort began to feel like evidence of your character. If everyone was content, you were good. If someone became disappointed, you searched for the failure inside yourself. Their emotional state served as a moral verdict. Even when their disappointment came from being denied something they had never been entitled to receive. Such a system makes separation feel cruel. The moment another person suffers because you stopped accommodating them, you experience their pain as proof that accommodation should resume. You do not ask whether the expectation was fair. You ask how quickly you can remove the discomfort. Guilt appears before judgment has examined what actually happened. But guilt is not always a reliable confession. Sometimes it is the emotional residue of disobeying an old role. It says that something familiar has been violated, not necessarily that something wrong has occurred. The intensity can be real while the accusation is false. Your chest may feel condemned even when your refusal was honest and proportionate. The persona was never meaningless. It helped you belong, cooperate, and become recognizable in a world that requires recognizable faces. Yet, when one role receives nearly all the approval, the personality begins organizing itself around maintaining that role. You stop asking whether compliance expresses your character and begin assuming that character requires compliance. The cost appears when ordinary refusal feels like moral collapse. Your conscious identity has become so attached to goodness that anger, reluctance, and self-interest seem foreign, yet these excluded responses carry necessary information. Reluctance may show that your resources are limited. Anger may reveal an unspoken demand. Self-interest may simply announce that another life exists inside the relationship. Because these reactions were unwelcome, they often appeared indirectly. You agreed, then delayed. You offered help, then felt strangely cold. You listened with patience, then avoided the person for days. The pleasing response preserved the image of kindness, while the disowned refusal returned through distance. Fatigue and resentment. You may have judged yourself for this inconsistency. Why offer care and then feel burdened by giving it? Why say yes and secretly wish the other person had never asked? The contradiction becomes clearer when you see that the spoken agreement and the buried answer were not the same. One protected belonging, the other protected the part of you being spent without consent. You can hear this most clearly in the family room. At the table where your role was assigned before you could read, someone makes a remark designed to return you to it. Nothing hostile, nothing memorable, just a sentence so ordinary that no one else notices it was said. For the first time, you hear it as a sentence rather than as the truth. Your voice does not rise, your face does not change, but something in you has stopped receiving the instruction as though it came from reality itself. This does not make every act of generosity false. Much of your care was sincere. You often wanted to help, comfort, and understand. The problem was that willingness had no protected boundary around it. Genuine generosity and compulsory agreement became difficult to separate. So, even loving gestures accumulated the weight of obligations. You were not allowed to question. People around you could not always perceive that difference. They saw what you offered, not the silent negotiation that preceded it. Your quick yes looked effortless. Your patience appeared natural because you hid the cost so successfully. They learned to experience your giving as an ordinary feature of the relationship, rather than a choice made by a person with limits. Then, when the giving changes, they may believe something essential has been taken from them. From their perspective, you are withholding what you always were. From yours, you are discovering that what looked like personality was partly uninterrupted availability. Both people confront a loss, but they are not grieving exactly the same thing. You may grieve the person you hoped they would become once you had given enough. Somewhere beneath the pleasing was a quiet expectation that devotion would eventually be recognized. One day, they would notice how much you carried. One day, your care would inspire equal care. One day, the relationship would become mutual without requiring you to risk asking for mutuality. That hope made the imbalance bearable. Each sacrifice seemed like an investment in future safety. You were not only meeting the present request, you were building a case for why you should someday be treated with tenderness. But unspoken devotion does not guarantee reciprocity. Sometimes it merely creates a relationship in which one person gives and the other learns that giving will continue. Admitting this can awaken anger, but beneath the anger is often humiliation. You may feel ashamed that you waited so long or offered so much without asking what was being returned. Yet shame ignores the original purpose of the bargain. You were not foolish for wanting love. You were trying to earn securely what you did not believe could survive your unmet needs and inconvenient truth. The deeper difficulty is that stopping the bargain does not immediately create the closeness you wanted. It first removes the method you used to imitate security. You lose the reassurance of being indispensable before you discover whether you can be valued without constant usefulness. The empty space between those experiences can feel colder than the old arrangement. In that space, you may want to become useful again merely to feel recognizable. A request arrives, and the familiar role offers instant direction. You know who to be, what to say, and how to restore warmth. Refusing leaves you with your own unstructured life, and that life may feel strangely quiet because so much of it was organized around responding to others. Pleasing did not only protect relationships, it protected you from the uncertainty of preference. If everyone else's needs provided your direction, you rarely had to discover what your own life required. Their urgency gave you purpose. Their relief confirmed your value. Without those signals, freedom can resemble emptiness before it begins to resemble choice. This is the shadow beneath endless accommodation. Part of you resented being needed, while another part depended on need to make your place unquestionable. Being necessary protected you from wondering whether you would be chosen when you were offering nothing. The role took from you, but it also spared you the exposure of being present without a service to justify your presence. That truth does not cancel what others demanded or excuse their coldness. It reveals why the arrangement remained stable even when it caused pain. They received ease, attention, and access. You received belonging, identity, and protection from direct rejection. The exchange was unequal, but it contained rewards powerful enough to keep both sides from naming its terms. Now the old rewards are becoming less persuasive. Approval still brings relief, but the relief no longer erases the resentment beneath it. Being needed still creates purpose, but purpose no longer compensates for being unknown. The agreement may still function socially, yet something inside you has stopped believing that compliance and love are the same experience. This leaves you in an uncomfortable middle place. You can see the bargain clearly enough that obedience no longer feels innocent. But you may not yet trust that connection can endure your separateness. The old role still offers warmth. The new refusal still carries grief. And for a while, both truths remain present without giving you an easy answer. The absence of an easy answer is what makes this stage so difficult. You can no longer return to automatic agreement without feeling your own absence. Yet, refusal does not bring immediate peace. It brings the full emotional consequence that compliance once prevented. Other people react. Your guilt awakens, and the relationship begins moving without your usual control. At first, every change may appear to confirm your worst fear. Someone calls less often. A familiar invitation does not arrive. A person who once praised your kindness becomes strangely formal. You notice the distance and wonder whether your emerging limits have made you impossible to love. The old role seems to whisper that none of this would be happening if you had remained generous. What is happening, however, is more complicated than rejection. Some people are waiting for the familiar pattern to resume. Others are uncertain how to approach a person whose preferences they never had to consider. A few may be respecting the distance they think you requested. Not every silence carries the same meaning, even when your fear translates all silence into abandonment. This is why seeing who valued your compliance requires more than observing who becomes uncomfortable. Nearly everyone who knew the accommodating version of you will experience some disruption. The deeper evidence appears in what they do with that disruption. Can they become curious, adjust, and remain emotionally present? Or must your old availability return before connection becomes possible again? You may be tempted to test them. Perhaps you stop initiating contact to see who notices. You withhold help and silently wait for proof that someone cares about you apart from what you provide. When no one responds as you hoped, the pain seems decisive, yet hidden tests often reproduce the same problem. Your need remains unspoken, while the relationship is judged for failing to recognize it. For years, you expected yourself to perceive what others could not say. It is understandable that some part of you now wants them to demonstrate love in the same way. You want someone to notice the change in your tone, sense the exhaustion beneath your silence, and offer care without being asked. Their failure to do so can feel like confirmation that they never saw you. Sometimes that conclusion is accurate. Some relationships truly contained little interest in your interior life, but sometimes another person does not know that your withdrawal contains a request to be found. They may see distance and assume you want space. The painful truth is that being known requires forms of expression that pleasing allowed you to avoid. Compliance made your communication deceptively clear. Everyone knew what you would offer because the answer was usually yes. Now your inner experience contains reluctance, desire, affection, anger, and uncertainty at the same time. The task is no longer to produce the answer that preserves harmony. It is to remain honest while several conflicting feelings are still present. This is what the 2 seconds are for. They were never empty. They were the only place where the answer could have become yours. And for most of your life, something else occupied them before you arrived. Now the space stays open, and you have to stand in it without knowing what you will find there. The delay may frustrate people who were accustomed to instant reassurance. It also reveals how rarely your agreement was given time to become a real choice. Without that pause, kindness could not tell you whether it was freely offered. It arrived too quickly to contain consent. Now even a sincere yes may require you to pass through resistance first. You need to know whether the giving belongs to affection, fear, a bit, or the wish to avoid another person's disappointment. You may overcorrect. After years of saying yes too easily, no can begin to feel cleaner than uncertainty. Refusal protects you from being absorbed, and its firmness may produce a relief you have rarely known. For a while, you might mistake that relief for proof that distance is always more truthful than accommodation. Yet refusal can become another automatic identity. The pleasing person was controlled by the fear of disappointing others. The unreachable person may still be controlled by the same fear, only now the strategy has changed. Instead of securing love through agreement, you prevent disappointment by denying anyone enough access to ask something of you. This is a deeper shadow reversal. Once you see that some people preferred your compliance, you may begin treating every need as attempted control. and every disappointment as evidence of conditional love. Suspicion promises to protect the self that pleasing abandoned, but if every request becomes a threat, other people are still determining your behavior. Opposition has replaced obedience without creating freedom. Jung called the long movement toward a less divided life individuation, and he was insistent about what it is not. It is not the replacement of one mask with a harder one. It is not the triumph of a repressed side over the side that ruled before. It is the slow work of holding opposites without allowing either to seize the whole personality. Wholeness, in his sense, is not purity, it is capacity. Anger carries information, but it also carries accumulated time. A minor request may awaken the force of every request you accepted unwillingly. The person in front of you receives a reaction shaped partly by people who came before them. This does not make the anger invalid. It means the returning emotion requires responsibility as well as permission. You may hear sharpness enter your voice before you understand its size. The other person looks surprised, and shame follows immediately. Then the old identity seizes the moment. It tells you that boundaries have made you cruel and that your previous silence was kinder. But buried resentment and deliberate refusal are not the same thing. One erupts after self-abandonment. The other speaks before resentment must accumulate. Learning that difference is uncomfortable because it removes the innocence of both extremes. You cannot pretend that endless pleasing was pure goodness. You also cannot assume that every harsh response is justified because you were accommodating for too long. The pain you carried deserves recognition, but it does not grant every returning emotion authority over how another person is treated. This is where separation becomes morally complex. You are trying to stop abandoning yourself without using self-protection to abandon everyone else. You are learning that another person can be disappointed without being oppressive, and that you can feel pressured without being powerless. The old arrangement erased your will. A colder arrangement could erase theirs. Some people will make this distinction difficult. They will use your anger to dismiss the limit beneath it. If your voice becomes tense, they focus only on your tone. If your explanation is imperfect, they treat the imperfection as evidence that the request itself was unreasonable. You may feel compelled to present your boundary flawlessly before allowing it to count. But a limit does not become unreal because it emerged awkwardly. Years of suppressed refusal do not always return in graceful language. You may still need to acknowledge unnecessary sharpness while keeping the answer unchanged. An apology for how something was spoken does not require an apology for having a separate need. This distinction may feel almost impossible at first. In the old system, apology meant restoration. You admitted fault, softened the truth, and returned access. Now you may say that you regret causing pain while refusing to remove the condition that caused it. Your mouth speaks care, but the old rescue does not follow. The guilt may intensify because the familiar ritual remains incomplete. There is a version of this you may recognize after an ordinary conversation. When the other person leaves, you realize how much lighter and quicker your voice became whenever they pressed against your limit. The change happened before you decided anything. It belonged to a pattern rehearsed long before this exchange. Another person may cry, become distant, or remind you of everything they have done for you. Their pain can be sincere, even when it also pressures you. You do not have to decide that the emotion is false in order to remain separate from its demand. Someone can be genuinely hurt by your change without possessing the right to reverse it. This is one of the most difficult truths for an empath to carry. You can understand another person's pain and still allow them to experience it, not because their suffering is unimportant, but because removing every painful feeling has required you to erase information the relationship needed. Their disappointment may be the first honest consequence your compliance no longer absorbs. Allowing that consequence can feel like causing harm. Your stomach contracts when they become quiet, and every learned response urges you to repair the atmosphere. Yet repair is not always the same as restoring the previous arrangement. Sometimes repair begins when both people remain present while neither one receives the exact emotional outcome they wanted. You wanted your limit to be accepted without loss. They wanted the relationship to remain unchanged despite your limit. Neither wish may be available. Something has already changed because the hidden agreement is visible now. Even if you return to pleasing, you will know what the warmth required. The old innocence cannot be recreated through another yes. Grief enters precisely here. You are grieving not only people who may withdraw, but the fantasy that self-respect would reveal everything cleanly. You may have imagined that genuine love would immediately celebrate your change, and conditional love would expose itself at once. Real relationships are less obedient to categories. Love, obedience, entitlement, fear, and tenderness often exist together. There may be no single conversation that tells you who loved you. The truth emerges through repeated encounters. Who can hear no without turning it into humiliation? Who remembers your preferences when there is nothing to gain? Who permits you to change without continually comparing you with the easier person you once appeared to be? The same questions must eventually be directed inward. Can you hear another person's no without experiencing it as rejection? Can you allow them preferences that inconvenience you? Mutuality asks you to release the very standard of wordless understanding that once defined your own devotion. This can be humbling. You may realize that you also felt safest with people who needed little from you, because their independence protected you from the exposure of receiving. You may have preferred relationships where your role was obvious and your vulnerability remained hidden. Compliance shaped who approached you, but it also shaped whom you allowed close. Seeing your participation does not equal responsibility for every imbalance. It means the pattern lived through more than what others took. It lived through what you offered before being asked, what you refused to name, and what you hoped people would understand without hearing. The arrangement concealed their limitations, but it concealed your longing as well. Now, the longing becomes harder to avoid. Beneath the anger is not only the wish to be left alone, there is a wish to be met without becoming useful first. There is a wish for another person to know your preferences and remain interested. Admitting this desire may feel more exposing than any refusal, because it carries no guarantee of being answered. The old role protected you from that uncertainty by making you valuable in advance. Without it, you must face the possibility that some people will not choose the unperformed relationship you want. You must also face the possibility that others might choose it. While you remain unsure how to receive affection that has not been purchased through accommodation, so the separation remains unfinished. You cannot fully return to pleasing because you have heard the resentment beneath your agreement. You cannot make distance your final answer because the desire for mutual closeness has also become visible. The old bargain is failing, but the person who can live without it is still learning how to remain present. Learning to remain present begins in ordinary moments. Someone asks for help, and you notice that the answer is not immediately available. Instead of offering yourself before the question has fully landed, you let the silence remain. Their face changes slightly. Your breath becomes shallow, but the pause is no longer filled with an agreement you have not chosen. 2 seconds, that is all it is, yet it may be the first territory you have ever occupied. That pause alters the relationship more than a dramatic confrontation might. It removes the certainty that your time, attention, and understanding are already available. The other person must now encounter you as someone whose answer has not been decided by their need. They may experience this uncertainty as distance because immediate access once felt like closeness. Some will attempt to shorten the pause. They explain why the request matters, remind you how rarely they ask, or speak as if your hesitation has already injured them. Their words may sound reasonable. What becomes visible is how quickly your uncertainty is converted into something you must defend. One person presses for an answer. Another lets the silence remain. The difference reveals how much room your inner life is given. You may still say yes. The difference is that the agreement no longer arrives as proof of goodness. It becomes a particular choice made under particular conditions. You can feel whether the giving leaves warmth behind or quietly removes you from yourself. The answer alone does not reveal the pattern. The inner cost of producing it does. At times, you will say no and watch a familiar expression disappear. Someone who called you generous may describe you as selfish. Someone who admired your understanding may say that you have become cold. Their judgment can enter deeply because it uses the language of the identity you once worked so hard to maintain. They may sincerely believe what they are saying. From within the old arrangement, your change can look like withdrawal. They experienced your constant accommodation as your natural character, not as effort. When effort stops, they do not always see a person becoming more honest. They see care being removed from a relationship that once seemed to contain an endless amount of it. This does not mean you must persuade them otherwise. Explaining the pattern may help some relationships, but explanation cannot force another person to accept the loss of privilege. You can describe your exhaustion perfectly and still meet resistance. Understanding your reason would require them to reconsider what they once received without question. Their resistance may awaken the old impulse to provide more evidence. You list everything you have done, every request you accepted, and every moment you remained silent. Yet the deeper issue cannot always be proven through an account of sacrifices. The fact that you consented before does not mean you must consent again. Your present limit does not require a history of suffering to become legitimate. Certain people will slowly adjust. Their first reaction may be disappointment, but they return with curiosity. They begin asking instead of assuming. They notice when you are quiet without demanding immediate reassurance. The relationship becomes less smooth for a while, yet more reality enters it. Affection is no longer protected from the existence of two separate wills. This change can feel less intimate at first. The old closeness depended on anticipation. You sensed what they needed before they spoke, and they rarely had to risk asking directly. Now both people must use words, hear limits, and tolerate answers they did not design. The relationship loses some of its effortless quality because what seemed effortless was largely your effort. Other relationships will not adjust. Weeks of silence pass, then a warm message arrives asking how you have been. Old gladness rises before you notice the request that follows. The question about your life was the doorway, the request was the room, and the warmth withdraws when the doorway has served its purpose. Across time, repetition says what no single reaction could prove. Their attachment was strongest when your function remained intact. Even then, the truth may not be that they felt nothing for you. They may miss your company and still be unable to relate beyond what you provided. They may carry tenderness, memory, and dependence together. Human feeling can be genuine without being mature enough to include your freedom. Love may exist inside a structure that cannot tolerate equality. This recognition removes the comfort of simple anger. It would be easier if every person who resisted your limits had been deliberately deceptive. Then grief could harden into judgment, and judgment could protect you from longing. Instead, you may see that some people cared for you only as far as their own emotional capacity allowed. Their capacity may explain the limitation, but it does not change what life inside that limitation required from you. You can understand why someone needed constant reassurance while admitting that providing it consumed your peace. You can recognize their fear of losing closeness without agreeing that closeness must be secured through your obedience. The social cost may become visible in groups as well. When you stop smoothing every tension, other people are forced to experience one another more directly. Someone must carry their own discomfort. A disagreement stays unresolved longer. The atmosphere becomes less pleasant, and the person who once managed it may be blamed for the discomfort that was always present. You may hear that everyone has to be careful around you now. What they sometimes mean is that they have begun considering your experience before speaking or asking. Consideration feels like restriction only when your unlimited flexibility was treated as normal. What is new for them is not your sensitivity, it is the loss of freedom from having to notice it. Yet not every criticism should be dismissed as resistance. Someone may tell you that your refusals have become sharp or that your silence leaves them uncertain. The fact that the old role was costly does not make every new reaction complete. You can listen without surrendering. You can examine your manner without placing your existence back on trial. This is one of the quiet capacities emerging beneath the separation. Feedback no longer has to become a command. Another person can describe their experience, and you can consider what belongs to you without absorbing everything they feel. Their hurt may influence the conversation without determining the verdict. You begin noticing that guilt also changes when it is allowed to remain. At first, it fills the whole inner field. Your stomach contracts, sleep becomes restless, and the urge to send another message grows stronger. But when the old repair does not occur, guilt eventually separates into different feelings that compliance once kept fused together. Some of it is sorrow because someone you love is disappointed. Some is fear that distance will become permanent. Some may be genuine regret for speaking carelessly. Once these feelings become distinct, They no longer issue one identical instruction. Not every discomfort asks you to abandon the limit. Grief also becomes more precise. You grieve the people who withdraw, but you may grieve even more deeply when someone stays and reveals how little they knew about you. They ask what you prefer, and you cannot answer. Their willingness exposes how long your own desires remained unpracticed. Mutuality has appeared, but the self invited into it is still finding language. You might discover that preference begins with unimpressive things. Which conversation you have energy for, whether you want company or quiet, what kind of help you can give without resentment. These decisions do not announce a transformed identity, they simply allow ordinary life to contain information that once disappeared beneath everyone else's urgency. Receiving care may remain uncomfortable. When someone offers help without requiring usefulness in return, you search for the hidden debt. You prepare to repay them before the kindness has fully reached you. Yet, occasionally the transaction does not appear. The person contributes because connection includes their effort too, and you are left with the unfamiliar exposure of being cared for. This can reveal another difference between being needed and being known. Being needed gave you a clear position. Being known requires you to remain present while another person responds to needs you did not disguise. You cannot earn the response in advance or control what it means. You can only witness whether care moves in both directions when no one is performing indispensability. Relationships capable of this movement may become quieter. There is less emergency, less guessing, and less proof offered through sacrifice. The absence of intensity can initially resemble a loss of feeling. Yet the quieter bond asks more from both people. It asks them to state what they need, risk refusal, and remain connected when neither person becomes the other's solution. You may still miss the immediacy of the old role. Being the person everyone relied upon made your value visible. Mutual affection is often less dramatic. It does not always produce praise or urgency. It may appear as someone remembering your limit, accepting a delayed answer, or remaining warm when you have nothing useful to offer. Gradually, these small encounters change what love means in your experience. Love is no longer measured only by how much you can endure for another person. It also becomes visible in how much reality the relationship can contain. Your no, their disappointment, your care, their separate needs, and the uncertainty of what happens next can exist without one person disappearing. Some bonds will become stronger under this greater weight. Others will remain distant. A few may end without a final argument because the function that kept them active is no longer being performed. You may never receive confirmation of what they felt or why they left. The absence of certainty is part of what you can now carry without turning compliance into an investigation. You no longer need to decide that everyone who left loved only what you provided. That verdict would preserve anger, but it would also reduce the complexity you have worked to recover. Some loved you incompletely. Some confused your giving with your nature. Some lacked the capacity to change. Their limitations matter without becoming the entire meaning of your life with them. Nor must you dismiss the devotion you once offered. Your kindness was not meaningless because fear sometimes accompanied it. Your empathy was not false because it became entangled with the need for approval. Those qualities remain yours, but they no longer have to appear on command. What was once compulsory can become a choice, and choice gives generosity back its honesty. The people who remain may still prefer your easier version on difficult days. You may still feel tempted to become that person when silence lasts too long. Nothing has been settled permanently. The difference is that discomfort can now exist without automatically becoming evidence that you must return to the old role. You can miss someone and refuse the arrangement that kept them close. You can feel guilty and leave the answer unchanged. You can recognize another person's pain without treating yourself as its remedy. Separation no longer requires certainty that they were wrong. It requires enough honesty to stop making your disappearance the condition of peace. Another request will eventually arrive, and the 2 seconds will open again. This time, you may be present when they do. Whatever answer comes may feel, for once, less borrowed from anyone else. Love remained possible, but compliance no longer spoke for it.